The work I'm going to look at today covers some of the health and safety training, and the area I'm going to look at in particular is risk assessment. A risk assessment is a logical process of evaluating the potential hazards and risks that might be involved in an activity, then implementing procedures to manage or remove the risk. The subsequent written document can be used to prepare staff to manage identified risks and provide any necessary training and precautions. So let's have a look at the terms that relate to risk assessment and the different types of risk assessment that you may come across. A generic risk assessment is a risk assessment that applies to all sites and activities. So for example, you might be working on a site every week. You will have done a risk assessment initially for most of the tasks, and that will remain pretty much unchanged. But you could modify that to adapt to specific sites. So you'd have the kind of core information, and then you would add additional information as and when. A site-specific risk assessment is a risk assessments that have been adapted to a specific site, and they only contain relevant information for that particular project. Site-specific risk assessments take into account the actual site conditions and type of project and address relevant hazards of that specific site. Task-specific risk assessments. Fairly self-explanatory, really. These risk assessments are designed around a specific task. For example, in the horticultural industry, a task-specific risk assessment would be used for example, pesticide spraying. So it's not a task that you're doing all the time necessarily, but it just relates to that particular risky or additional risk, or the additional hazards related to spraying. The environment is everything around you, including the soil, the trees, your surroundings. So an environmental risk assessment allows you to look at the likelihood of your business causing harm to the environment. This includes identifying potential hazards and impacts on local environments, and it might include, or should include, identifying any local habitats or protected areas that you would not necessarily be aware of. And it will set out procedures to ensure the local environment where you're working is left unharmed. And later on, when you look at some of the other modules, we cover the potential damage that you could cause to the environment through your horticultural actions. Emergency action plan. You may come across these in your workplace. An emergency action plan is a course of actions developed to mitigate the damage of potential events that could endanger both people or your personnel and your organisation's ability to function on a daily basis. Such a plan should include measures that provide for the safety of personnel and, if possible, property and facilities. There's two real main kind of terms that you'll come across when we're talking about risk assessment. And as part of Unit 1, you will need to complete a risk assessment, and that can be found in the task section of the module. But a hazard is anything that's a potential to cause harm, something that's sharp or hot or a chemical, ladders, using work equipment on a steep slope. The risk is a chance, whether it's low, medium or high, that someone will be harmed by the hazard. And it's important to look at those two words, hazard and risk, and determine the hazards and the risks that are caused by that particular hazard. And by doing so, you then can look at the ways to reduce the potential of being hurt. So we look at the hazards. We decide who might be harmed. We look at the risks and decide on how we're going to take precautions against those risks. We record our findings on a risk assessment form, which I'll show you at the end. And then you review those. You go back and look at them to make sure they're still relevant and that they're still usable within that site and that nothing's changed. So step one is to identify the hazards. First, you need to work out how people could be harmed. When you work in a place every day, it's easy to overlook some hazards. Here's a couple of tips to help you identify the ones that really matter. We're only really interested in the main hazards. If you live, for example, on a flight path for an airport, the chances of being hit by an aircraft are pretty slim. So you really wouldn't put them as a hazard. But if you worked on the fringes or the apron of an airport or a runway, then the chances of being clipped by a wing or sucked into a jet engine increase. So you may then start to add those as hazards. Walk around your workplace and look at what could reasonably be expected to cause harm. Ask the people you work with, other people on site, what they think. They may have more experience than you, so therefore they can add to the pot. They may spot hazards that you haven't noticed, that they're not as obvious to you because of your inexperience within the industry. Step 2. Decide who might be harmed. Who do you work with on site? For each of the hazards, you need to be clear about who might be harmed. It will help you to identify the best way of managing the risk. It doesn't mean writing a whacking great list by name, but rather identifying people by groups, people working in particular areas that you're working in, passers-by, members of the public. And that might change. You might go work in a school, so the people who might be harmed might be the kids and the teachers. How close do they come to you? Are they likely to be harmed by what you do? Are you likely to be harmed? So when you're putting that part of deciding who might be harmed, have a think about all the people who could potentially access that particular area at that particular time when you're undertaking work. So members of the public and the people you work with are the most likely people that you're going to be putting down on the risk assessment. Step 3 then, evaluate the risks and decide on what you're going to do and the precautions, how you're going to reduce the chance of somebody getting hurt. So having spotted the hazards, you then have to decide what you're going to do about them. The law requires you to do everything reasonably practicable to protect people from harm. And if you can show that you've taken every reasonable step to protect people and something still happens, well, you should be covered. When controlling risks, apply the principles below in the following order. Try a less risky option. You could, for example, switch to using a less hazardous chemical. If it's not as effective, then it may not be something that you can do or consider. Organise your work to reduce the exposure to the hazard. Put some barriers up between pedestrians and traffic. Put signs up. Issue personal protective equipment, clothing, footwear, goggles, ear defenders. All of those things that you should be using on a daily basis as part of your PPE are part of the risk assessment. How are you reducing the risk? For example, noise. How are you reducing the risk and the damage to your ears? By wearing ear defenders. So they need to be available and in good condition. So you record what you found. If there's an accident on site, someone will ask you, where is your risk assessment? And you should be able to find it. In the horticultural module, Unit 1, you will have to show evidence of where the documents are held within your workplace. So record your findings and then put them into action. Write down the results of your risk assessment, share them with your staff and the people you work with. If you have fewer than 5 employees, you don't necessarily have to write anything down. So for example, if we're leading an expedition in Scouts, there's only a few of us, we'll have a chat about the risks associated with the walk or whatever we're doing. We may make a variation to that, so we might have an incidental risk assessment where we come, say for example, to a field and something's changed. Maybe there's some cows in the field and we weren't there the last time, or we didn't anticipate there'd be any issues. So we would then have a chat and say, right, here are the risks on this specific area, on this site, on this change of direction that we've implemented. There's cows in this field, you need to run, or let's find an alternative route. You need to be able to show that you did a proper and thorough check. You asked the people who might be affected by the work, so you didn't just guess what might happen, you went and spoke with them. They use the machines on a regular basis. You dealt with all the significant hazards, taking into account the number of people who could be involved. And you need to show that the precautions are reasonable, that the remaining risk is low, and you involved your staff or anybody else in that who's involved in that process. You need to look at what you've done. A few workplaces stay the same. Sooner or later, you'll be bringing in new equipment, substances, other procedures that could lead to a new hazard. Makes sense, therefore, to review what you're doing on an ongoing basis. Every year or so, formally review the risk assessments that you have, starting, which by then will be more or less generic risk assessments. Have a look at them. Note that you've reviewed them, that they're up to date, that you've actually gone and checked to see what has changed and what new things you might need to log. Here's an example. It's very similar to the risk assessment form that you'll get, or that I'll send you in Unit 1. So it starts with the company name, obviously, and who did the risk assessment, the date, and the date of the next review. That's important. So that's the date that you're going to look at it and make those changes. In this column here, you can list the activity. So in this example, we've listed the strimming and a few of the hazards. So flying debris is a hazard. Sharp blades, if you're using brush cutter, hazard, and a noise is a hazard. So you're strimming on site. Who could we harm? Yourself, me, members of the public, your workmates, anybody who could potentially be on that site at that time. What are you doing? We restrict access to the site by putting signs up. We train our staff. They sign to say they've had the training. We don't let them on a machine till they've done it. We provide the correct PPE. What could we do better? What could we improve? What further actions do we need to take? We could use better signs. That'd be good. Put more signs up. Let's get the staff some more signs. It might be that this is in response to a change or an incident or a near miss, and you go, do you know what? We could have done better than that. We can do better. We can make sure that people coming onto the site don't just walk past, or they walk round, and that there's some signage so they know we're there. The question is, who's going to do it? Well, we'll ask John on his next visit to begin to implement some of the changes. But he's there on the 19th of Feb, so that's a good time to do it. And when he's done it, can we ask him to tick it off over here? Identifying the main hazards, the main risks, who might be harmed, what are you going to do about it, what's already been done, what do we need to do to make it better, who's going to do it, when's it done, and when should we look at it again? So I like the wiggly bits. In summary then, we identify the hazards and risks, we assess the risks, we look at controlling it, and then we review that later on. So thanks for watching, and hopefully you can then move on and complete a risk assessment as part of the tasks and the learner journals that you need to do. And you can now move on to the next part of the training in this module on health and safety. Thank you.